So I've been meaning to do this for a while now. In the book that I wrote, the all-time greatest NBA book, counting down the 50 greatest teams, playoff runs by a player, playoff moments, and the 100 greatest players of all time, I dedicated the first 2 chapters to ranking the 50 greatest teams ever. If you read the book, you remember that I took a page from the college football playoff ranking system to have a basis of my top 50 lists. One of the reasons why I did that was because I wanted a dedicated chapter to where I got the top 6 teams in NBA history to play against each other in a playoff style tournament, just like they do in the college football playoffs. But I also wanted to include a few noteworthy bowl games, where we get to discuss a few intriguing matchups. For example, I talked about who would win between the 1997 Utah Jazz versus the 1993 Phoenix Suns, the 1990 Detroit Pistons versus the 2016 Golden State Warriors, the 2009 Lakers versus the 2016 Cleveland Cavaliers, and the 2013 Miami Heat versus the 1992 Chicago Bulls in a 7-game series. Those were the only teams that I wrote about that didn't make the NBA all-time playoffs, as I call it. The reason was that, I quote, "Before we get to the 16 playoffs, there are some notable bowl game matchups that we'll discuss. In a perfect world, I would write about all 24 bowl games and decide on the winner of each 7-game series. But that's what YouTube and podcasts are for. So here we are. It's been a long time coming. The first bowl game that we are going to discuss is between a 30-ranked team, the 1998 Chicago Bulls, versus a 28-ranked team, the 2007 San Antonio Spurs. Since the Spurs are the higher-ranked team, they get home court advantage in the current 2-2-1-1-1 format that the NBA uses. Let's start by comparing the numbers. One thing that we notice right off the bat is that these are 2 defensive-oriented teams. Look how equally matched they are on defense. Their defensive rating is nearly identical, as well as the average points per game allowed. And one other important thing, they both play at the same pace. These 2 teams prefer to play at a slower pace and grind it out. The Spurs during this time were experts at forcing the opposing teams to play at their pace and converting the games into a complete slugfest. Well, the Bulls have no problems with that. In fact, that's the style they prefer to play. So this series will ultimately be decided by who executes their game plan better and who can impose their will over the other. We know Michael Jordan can win games by himself, but the Spurs can also use their balanced scoring attack between the trio of Duncan, Ginobili, and Parker to win these games. So one thing that I can say for certain is that this will be a long and hard-fought series, that's for sure. Speaking of the players, let's now look at the roster of the 2 teams. Here are the top 8 players that will get significant playing time for the series, along with the per-game numbers for the season. The Chicago Bulls and the San Antonio Spurs both kept the same core from the previous 3 years. The Bulls won 3 straight championships with that core, and the Spurs won 2 titles in a span of 3 years. For the Chicago Bulls, Michael Jordan was the MVP of the league and was also the league leader in scoring. He was still the best player in the world, and he would be the best player in this hypothetical series. Scottie Pippen didn't make the All-Star team, but that's only because he missed the first half of the season due to injuries. He was starting to decline a bit on the scoring end, but he was still one of the game's best defenders. That was the Bulls' biggest strength, and Pippen was a big reason why they were so dominant. Now, one of the biggest criticism that the Bulls received from this season was that they had an aging roster. They had a total of 6 players that were 30 years or older. However, the 2007 Spurs had just as many aging players as the Bulls did. They had 8 players that were 30 years or older, including 3 players that were over 35. The Bulls only had 1 player that was over 35 years old. So the lack of youth won't be much of a factor for this series. As far as the Spurs go, Tim Duncan was still a top 5 player in the league. Then Tony Parker and Manu Ginobili were both in the primes of their career. One other important piece that the Spurs had was Michael Finley. He was 33 years old during this time, but he was still a threat to score over 20 points in any given game. In fact, he was the X factor for that classic semifinal series against the Phoenix Suns. This Spurs team had a lot of experience and a lot of players that could step up at any given time. Now for the important part of the discussion that will help us determine who would win this hypothetical series. How will the main players perform against each other? Let's start with the higher ranked team, the Spurs. So we're going to start with Tim Duncan and how he's going to play against the front line of the Bulls. And he's going to do just fine. We're all in agreement on that. This is the greatest power forward of all time and one of the most skilled players at that position. I know the Bulls have Dennis Rodman and he's a great individual defender. But Duncan was listed as a center for the Spurs this season. So Phil Jackson will have to decide whether to put Luke Longley on him or Dennis Rodman. Either way, Duncan will make his mark on the series. We know this by what happened in the '98 playoffs. In the conference finals against the Pacers, Rick Smits averaged 16 points per game on 55% shooting. There was nothing Luke Longley could do to stop him. Then in the finals, Carmelo averaged 25 points per game on 50% shooting along with 10 rebounds. So I'm not worried about Duncan. He's going to get his. The problem is the other players on the Spurs, as the Bulls will look to put the pressure on Duncan to take on a heavy scoring load. The Bulls' biggest strength on defense was the length of the trio of Ron Harper, Michael Jordan, and Scottie Pippen. They were long, versatile, athletic, and strong players, so they caused havoc for the opposing perimeter players during their time. So how will Tony Parker do against that backcourt? He's quick, so he has that going for him. He could break down the defense that way, but I picture Parker having an up and down series. To be fair, there were times when the Bulls had a little bit of trouble guarding the quicker point guards in the league that season, but for the most part, they kept them at bay. I think Parker can reach his regular season averages, but it will most likely be on 43 to 46% shooting. Now for Manu Ginobili, I just don't know. He was not himself during this playoff run. He averaged 16.7 points per game on 40% shooting. There were 5 total games where he couldn't even score over 10 points. And then if Michael Jordan or Scottie Pippen is on him, it's going to be tough for him to shake off whatever was causing him to be inconsistent. The good news is that the Spurs have plenty of players outside of their big three that can generate points. We discussed already how important Michael Finney was to them. And then they have players like Bruce Bowen, Robert Horry, and Brent Berry that can help spread the floor with their outside shooting. So the Spurs use a more balanced scoring attack to win ball games. However, if Tony Parker and Manu Ginobili are both struggling, they will be on Duncan to win some of these crucial games. And he's more than capable of doing so. Now let's talk about the Chicago Bulls. Of course, we're going to start with Michael Jordan. So for the 1998 playoffs, he averaged 32.4 points per game on 46% shooting. Come on, who from the Spurs is going to stop MJ from scoring big numbers every single game? Bruce Bowen? Yeah, he was a very tough individual defender, but he only weighed around 185 pounds. Now for Michael Jordan in 1998, he was listed at 215 pounds, a clear advantage for MJ. And trust me, he was not the type of player that you can probe to shooting tough contested outside shots. He was going to back you down at the post, and there is nothing that Bowen can physically do to stop him. And if he even dares to attempt one of his dirty tactics on MJ, Lord have mercy on his soul. He is going to get angry, and as the opposing team, you want to avoid that at all cost. In fact, during this time, the coaching staff will make it abundantly clear that you need to leave Michael Jordan alone. So for sure, that would be the matchup that I would be most excited to watch. As far as the matchup between Duncan and Dennis Rodman, you know that Rodman won't be able to get in his head. Whatever Rodman tries, Duncan would just stare at him, blankly, not saying one word. So for comedic purposes, that would be fun to watch. But watching MJ get right in the face of Bowen, threatening him to stop the antics, or else, will be something that I would love to see. Now as far as Scottie Pippen, we already discussed how he would be able to affect the game defensively, and I know for a fact that he will dominate on that end of the floor. We know this by what we saw in Game 4 in the finals against the Utah Jazz, when the Bulls gave the most impressive defensive performance in NBA playoff history. They allowed the Jazz to score 54 points. Who was largely responsible for that legendary beatdown? According to the Chicago Tribune, it was Scottie Pippen. Check out what John Stockton said after the game. Quote, "With his length and athleticism, we're letting him come across to disrupt the Jazz offense. He certainly did it, and I thought he was a huge key with his defense." End of quote. He was so dominant on the defensive end that Sam Smith later wrote in that article, quote, "If the Bulls win these finals, Pippen should be the most valuable player." End of quote. If he was able to create havoc against that efficient offensive team, then he can certainly do that against this Spurs team. His ability to guard effectively all the players on the team will be huge for the Bulls. Now on the offensive end, it's going to be an up and down series for him, especially against a team like the Spurs that pride themselves on playing stifling defense. Now remember that Pippen played with a back injury in Game 6 of the Finals that originally occurred against the Pacers, but then he re-aggravated it in Game 5 of the Finals. Prior to that, Pippen was averaging 20 points per game on 47% shooting for the first 4 games. That's why league experts were seriously considering him winning Finals MVP. If he puts up that kind of production, then I can see the Bulls winning this series rather easily. But if he's shooting 25% or 16%, as he did at times during that playoff run, then the Bulls will have their work cut out for them. This is all hypothetically speaking, so who can say for certain? But I will say this. From 1996 to 1998, there was only one playoff series where Pippen shot over 45% from the field. So will he be efficient? No, he won't. That's what the numbers say. Depending on how much the Spurs can contain Pippen will be their biggest chance of defeating this team. Now let's get to the series prediction. This one's tough. I mean, the thing is that if Pippen is struggling from the field, then the Bulls still found ways to win. And if Tony Parker or Manu Ginobili were struggling, the Spurs also found ways to win. We're talking about teams that know how to win ugly. These were 2 championship experienced teams and very well coached teams. But you know what? I got the Bulls winning in 6 or 7. Here's my key takeaway. In the 2007 season, the Spurs had trouble winning games against teams with dominant wing players. So against the Lakers that had Kobe Bryant, the Rockets that had Tracy McGrady, the Heat that had Dwayne Wade, and the Cavaliers that had LeBron James, they went 3-8 during the regular season. Now I know that the Spurs demolished LeBron and the Cavs in the finals, but we're talking about a 22-year-old LeBron James with Larry Hughes as his second best player, compared to a seasoned veteran of Michael Jordan with Scottie Pippen as a co-star. So the Spurs had some trouble stopping teams with great perimeter players. And it's no surprise that in the following season, with the exact same core, the Spurs lost in 5 games against Kobe and the Lakers. And in that series, Kobe shot 53% from the field and nearly averaged 30 points per game. So imagine what Michael Jordan can do against his team. I don't think that Tim Duncan can keep up with that. And I think that's what it would take to beat this team. Historically speaking, that's not something that Duncan did much in the playoffs. Maybe the 03 version could, but I don't know about the 2007 Tim Duncan. But that's just my take. Let me know how you think this series will go down in the comment section. And if you haven't yet purchased the all-time greatest NBA book, get your copy today so you can also read about the in-depth analysis of the top 50 greatest teams of all time, which also includes who would win head-to-head among the 6 greatest teams ever. It's available on Amazon, Apple, and Kobo. Well, that's all for today. Thanks for watching the video. Till next time.